Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. In this video, I'm continuing to talk about the Russian Civil War. I'm going to start off by looking at the anti-religious campaign. The communists were avowed atheists. Marx was crystal clear about that in the Communist Manifesto. He thought all religions were nonsense. It was a racket. It was a trick by the poor to gull the rich, to gull the poor into accepting their poverty as divinely mandated and so on, and put off all their pleasures for the next life. Anyhow, the Reds were militantly anti-religious, and those who were religiously inclined were therefore driven into the arms of the Whites. The Orthodox Church had been little more than the mouthpiece of the reaction. The Tsars had tuned the pulpit, rather. The Bolsheviks saw the Orthodox Church as a form of reactionary psychological warfare, and about duping the proletariat and the peasantry. And there was an element of truth in the communist analysis there. So the Red authorities seized ecclesiastical property, and they turned it to other purposes, such as grain stores, eventually museums of atheism. So many buildings have been destroyed in the First World War and indeed in the Civil War that the property was needed for housing and everything else. Monasteries and convents were raided. Occasionally they were razed to the ground. Priceless works of art were sometimes vandalized. Lenin was totally against religion. However, he said it must be allowed to shrivel up and die of its own accord. We mustn't actually persecute it. The blood of martyrs being the seed of the church, as St. Paul said. If we expose religion to the daylight of reason and education, then it'll soon put paid to faith. Remember, most people in the Russian Empire were illiterate at that time. His acolytes took a proactive approach in evangelizing for unbelief. This was primarily against Christianity, but to a lesser extent amongst Islam. However, at the beginning of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks didn't control any of the Muslim majority areas. Orthodox priests and monks were sometimes killed by the Bolsheviks, and nuns sometimes ravished. The Whites were wondering, should they bring back Russian Orthodoxy as a state religion? The reactions would say yes, others would say no, it should be a secular state. Anyway, there was little doubt that if they hadn't been anti-religious, the Reds would have got more peasant support, because faith was a motivating force in getting some people to oppose them. So the Whites didn't work well together. They mistrusted each other because of radically different visions for what Russia should be like once the Civil War was over. So the Whites found it hard to communicate. Radio was the size of a fridge back then. So the postal service had long since ceased to function, and rail junctions, rail heads and so on, railway workshops were almost all in Red hands. So the Whites found it very difficult to coordinate attacks. Who was the Red leader? Anyone could answer that in a trice. It was Lenin. As soon as he became leader, he was filmed. This was shown in cinemas. His articles were printed on the front page of Pravda, the main newspaper, every day. So, without a doubt, he was the unchallenged supremo. And he was a dictator. This dictatorship of the proletariat instantly became a dictatorship on behalf of the proletariat, with power wielded by him. His image was everywhere. Who was the head of the Red Army? It was Trotsky, the People's Commissar for War. So he travelled around Russia in his armoured train, giving his rousing speeches. Despite his lack of military experience, he had mettle, and he put faith and hope into his men. So savage discipline was ineffectual. He'd have a man killed in the blinking of an eye. So he got some experienced officers who were Tsarists to come over to his side. Can you trust these men? Other Reds would ask him. Well, no, but I've taken their families hostage as a precaution, and if they desert, their children will be executed. And he did it. So some white officers who were captured by the Reds justified serving the Red side, saying, well, I'm defending Russia from invaders. The French, British, Serbians, all the rest of it are here, which is true. Brusilov offered his services to the Reds on this basis. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was another. He was from an aristocratic background, had been a Tsarist up to this time. So not many Tsarist officers did defect to the Reds. Trotsky did not trust his natural enemies, and rightly so. So the Reds were no snobs, and they promoted rankers who showed promise, and many of them had great leadership potential. One of them was later Marshal Georgy Zhukov. son of Afaria, who rose from private to marshal. Who was the white leader? Well, was it Admiral Kolchak in the Far East, General Denikin, General Kornilov, General Wrangel? Was it Tsar Nicholas II, Alexander Kerensky? Get the idea? It was unclear. There was no universally acknowledged leader or even collective leadership. One's leader depended on which sector of the front one was in and which faction one belonged to. Nicholas II had been in provisional government custody since the October Revolution. They later took him to Yekaterinburg with his family and retainers. So the Reds had made considerable gains in early 1918. They built on their impetus for the October Revolution. They signed the agreement, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers in March 1918. This set back their popularity. Moreover, towards the end of 1918, Allied troops began to arrive. August 1918. By then, Germany was on the ropes. Not quite defeated. We know the Germans collapsed in November 1918. The Allies couldn't afford to be complacent about that, so they didn't dispatch many troops till the war was actually over. In southern Russia, some whites formed the volunteer army. The Cossacks from the Don area joined the whites in great numbers. They had this freewheeling lifestyle and a personal devotion to the Tsar. This made them inimical to the Reds. So they were cavaliers in a sense. In the summer of 1918, the Reds were pressing hard. It became blatant that the Central Powers were living on borrowed time. American troops were landing in France at the rate of 1,000 a day. So every day the advantage tipped more and more and more towards the Allies. The Allies would soon defeat the Central Powers and be able to throw all their men against the Reds. So it was urgent for the Reds to create facts on the ground. If they effectively controlled most of the Russian Empire, the Allies might say, we won't bother, we'll just have to accept it. So the Reds, they spread their message far and wide. They were propagandizing. So on the Eastern Front, there had been fraternization between Central Powers troops and Russian Bolsheviks, and saying to these working class soldiers, why should you fight for the rich? How about the Brotherhood of Man, international socialism? So men who were apolitical or non-socialist often went home socialist or even committed communists. Central Powers prisoners who spent some years in Russia were exposed to the communist message. A case in point is Josip Broz, half Slovene, half Croat, a subject of Austria-Hungary, called up for that army, prisoner of war in Russia. Anyway, and he became a convinced communist. Later, he was Marshal Tito, the ruler of Yugoslavia. So some of these Central Powers prisoners in Russia were released and sent home. So communist Nostra caught on amongst demoralized Central Powers soldiers. Amongst French and British armies, these ideas made limited headway. Anyway, in Western Europe, there was not such a sharp distinction between the moderate and the extreme left. Parliamentary socialists in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party, tended to openly sympathise with the Reds, despite the brutality of the Reds towards democratic socialists in Russia. So, July 1918, the Romanovs were in Yekaterinburg. It was a headache for the whites, but the Reds were closing in. It was feared that the town might be captured. It might not be possible to evacuate the whites. The Romanovs. They might be rescued. The Romanovs were in Red custody. The whites might get them. They were held at Ipatiev House, named after the engineer who built it. So the Reds then dubbed it the House of Special Purpose. The whites, with the aid of the Czech Legion, made a major drive towards Yekaterinburg. It seemed sure that the town would fall to the whites. The Reds did not want the whites to have a figure to unite around. So Yakov Sverdlov in Moscow sent the order that the Romanovs must be liquidated, which meant killed. So on the night of the 17th or 18th of July, the Romanovs were awoken and said that rioting in town, come down to the basement for your own protection. Ooh, stand over there against the wall. We're going to have a photo taken. So a Latvian read out a proclamation to Nikolai Alexandrovich, saying that he was going to be immediately shot to death. The Tsar shouting, "Oh my God!" There are many written sources about this. He, his wife, 5 children, and a few servants were all shot dead by several gunmen. Quite a few Latvians who were prominent in the Red Army. So there were diamonds sewn into the bodices of these Romanov Grand Duchesses, shielded them for the first few bullets. But these soldiers, they emptied their revolvers into the bodies, so the whole place stank of cordite. So coup de grace was admitted to the heads of all of them. So their bodies were taken by truck, dipped in acid, and thrown into the Four Brothers mine. Won't go to the whole sordid spectacle, how they had to be dug up and buried somewhere else, and blah blah blah. Rumours surfaced within days that not all the Romanovs had been killed in the shooting. Most accounts say it was Grand Duchess Anastasia. Ironically, her name means resurrection in ancient Greek. That's what they say, Christos Anesti, Christ is risen, on Easter Monday in Greek churches. It was not until the 1990s this was comprehensively proved to be a canard by a DNA analysis and the skeletons found. And the most notorious pretender was Franciszka Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who was of roughly the same age as Anastasia.